Your soulmate is trying to reach you right now because it's urgent. Don't ignore this right now. Something is happening on their side that has disrupted the emotional balance they had carefully built over time, and it has placed you directly at the center of their thoughts in a way they did not expect. The urgency they feel did not come from nowhere. It grew out of a moment. One of those quiet but powerful moments when life suddenly slows down and forces someone to look directly at what truly matters. Until recently, they had been moving through life in a steady rhythm, focusing on responsibilities, conversations, and the endless routine that keeps people occupied. From the outside, everything probably looked completely normal. They spoke with people, made plans, worked through daily tasks, and continued forward just like anyone else trying to build stability in their life. But underneath that routine, there were things left unresolved, emotions that had never been fully addressed, questions that were never asked, and a connection with you that was never clearly defined after the silence began. For a long time, they managed to keep those thoughts quiet. Distraction is powerful in that way. When life stays busy enough, it becomes easy to believe that unresolved emotions have disappeared. They convince themselves that time had done its work, that whatever once existed between you had gradually softened and faded into memory. It was a comfortable explanation because it allowed them to continue moving forward without confronting uncertainty. But something happened recently that disrupted that comfort. It might have been a conversation with someone that unexpectedly reminded them of you. It might have been a personal moment where they suddenly realized who they would instinctively want to talk to if something truly important happened. Sometimes it is even something small, hearing a phrase you once said, encountering a place that carries shared memories, or seeing someone else struggle with unresolved feelings. That triggers a wave of reflection strong enough to shake someone out of their routine. Whatever the exact trigger was, it broke through the wall of distraction they had built. In that moment of reflection, your presence came back into their thoughts with surprising clarity. It wasn't just a passing memory. It was a realization that the connection between you had never been fully understood or properly closed. When they began thinking about the past more honestly, they noticed how many questions still existed between you. What were you truly feeling during the last meaningful conversations you shared? Did you interpret their silence the same way they interpreted yours? Were both of you trying to protect yourselves from vulnerability at the same time, unknowingly allowing distance to grow between you? These questions began to circulate in their mind with increasing intensity. They realized that much of what happened between you had been shaped by assumptions rather than clear communication. Assumptions are easy to rely on because they prevent uncomfortable conversations, but they are rarely reliable. Over time, those assumptions turned into the story they told themselves about the connection ending naturally. Yet now that story no longer feels convincing. The more they reflect, the more they recognize that the silence between you was not the same as closure. It was simply a pause filled with unanswered questions. This is why the feeling of urgency exists now. It is not panic. It is not desperation. It is a deep awareness that something meaningful was left incomplete. When people reach that kind of awareness, it creates a powerful internal pull toward honesty. They feel that pull right now. It is telling them that the conversation they once avoided may finally need to happen. They are realizing that ignoring the situation any longer would only extend the uncertainty they have been carrying for so long. For months they have wondered what you truly think about the past, what you might feel if you spoke again, and whether the distance between you was truly final or simply the result of timing and hesitation. Those questions have existed quietly in the background of their mind, but the recent event or realization brought them into the foreground where they can no longer be ignored. Another reason this moment feels urgent is because they have begun to see how fragile timing can be. Life has a way of reminding people that opportunities to speak honestly do not always remain available forever. Sometimes it takes a single unexpected moment to show someone that waiting for the right time can mean waiting too long. When that awareness arrives, it changes how a person looks at the past. They begin to think about the conversations they almost had but postponed. They remember the times they nearly reached out but stopped themselves because they feared saying the wrong thing. They recognize how pride, uncertainty, and fear of rejection quietly shaped their decisions. In your soulmate's case, those realizations are unfolding right now. They are starting to see that silence may have protected them from immediate vulnerability, but it also prevented clarity. And clarity is what they want now more than anything else. They want to know how you truly felt then and how you feel now. They want to understand whether the connection you shared was as meaningful to you as it was to them. They want to replace the assumptions they have been living with for so long with real answers. That desire for clarity is what drives the urgency behind reaching out. It is not about forcing the past to return or trying to control what happens next. It is about honesty. When someone reaches a point where honesty feels more important than comfort, they begin to act differently. They become willing to risk awkwardness or rejection because the alternative, continuing to live with uncertainty, feels worse. That is exactly where they are emotionally right now. They are recognizing that the connection between you deserves at least one honest conversation before it is permanently placed in the past. Whether that conversation leads to closure, understanding, or something entirely unexpected is impossible to know in advance. But they understand that avoiding the conversation guarantees only one outcome: continued uncertainty. And after the realization they experienced recently, uncertainty is no longer something they are comfortable carrying. This is why they are trying to reach you now. The urgency is not about drama or pressure. It is about the moment of clarity that arrived unexpectedly and changed how they see the situation between you. It reminded them that some connections remain meaningful even after long periods of silence, and that meaningful connections deserve honesty rather than endless assumptions. As the realization continued to grow stronger inside them, your soulmate began noticing how impossible it had become to return to the emotional routine they had been living in before. Only a short time earlier, they believed they had managed to organize their life in a way that allowed them to keep moving forward without reopening old questions. Work, responsibilities, conversations with other people, and the daily rhythm of life gave them structure. That structure made everything feel predictable and safe. But once the moment of clarity happened, that structure no longer felt stable. Instead, it felt like something carefully arranged to avoid deeper reflection. The more they thought about you, the more they recognized how often your presence had quietly appeared in their thoughts over the months, even when they tried not to focus on it. Sometimes it happened when they heard a piece of music that reminded them of a conversation you once had. Other times it appeared when they were explaining something personal to someone else and suddenly remembered how naturally you used to understand them. These were not constant thoughts, but they were frequent enough that they should have noticed the pattern sooner. Instead, they dismissed those moments quickly, convincing themselves that everyone occasionally remembers the past and that it does not necessarily mean anything deeper. Now they see those moments differently. They understand that those small reminders were signals that something unresolved still existed between you. At the time, ignoring them felt easier than asking questions that might not have simple answers. Yet the event or realization that happened recently changed that completely. It forced them to slow down and examine their own emotional history more carefully. When they did, they noticed something surprising. They realized that whenever something meaningful happened in their life, good news, difficult challenges, or moments of deep reflection, you were often the person who came to mind first. Sometimes the thought appeared only briefly before they redirected their attention somewhere else. But the fact that it appeared at all revealed something important about the connection you once shared. It meant that you had become part of their emotional reference point, the person they instinctively associated with understanding, support, and honest conversation. This recognition made them reconsider the way they interpreted the silence between you. For a long time they believed the distance meant that both of you had simply moved on in separate directions. That explanation felt logical because life often works that way. People meet, form connections, and eventually drift apart as circumstances change. But now they are beginning to question whether that explanation was entirely accurate. What if the distance was not the result of fading feelings but the result of hesitation? What if both of you were waiting for the other to speak first, unsure whether reopening communication would be welcome or uncomfortable? These possibilities are what created the urgency they feel right now. The realization that silence may have been based on mutual uncertainty rather than true emotional closure is difficult to ignore once it appears. It changes the entire way someone looks at the past. Suddenly the moments that once seemed like endings start to look more like unfinished conversations. They begin remembering specific situations when a single honest discussion might have clarified everything. Maybe there was a moment when one of you hesitated to express how you truly felt because you feared making things complicated. Maybe there was a misunderstanding that neither of you addressed because you believed the other person already understood. When those possibilities appear, they create a powerful desire to replace guesswork with truth. That is exactly what your soulmate is feeling now. They are tired of living with interpretations that may or may not reflect reality. They want to know what actually happened from your perspective. They want to understand whether the connection meant as much to you as it did to them. This is why the urge to reach you feels so strong at this moment. It is not driven by nostalgia alone. Nostalgia looks backward without asking questions. What they are experiencing now is different. It is curiosity combined with emotional honesty. They want to understand something that has remained unclear for far too long. Another factor that intensifies the urgency is their growing awareness that time changes people in ways that cannot always be predicted. They recognize that both of you have lived separate experiences since the last meaningful interaction you shared. You have both learned new things, met different people, and developed perspectives that did not exist before. That awareness brings both hope and uncertainty. On one hand, they wonder whether those experiences might have helped both of you understand yourselves better, making honest communication easier now than it was before. On the other hand, they also understand that time can create distance that cannot be reversed. You may have reached a place in your life where the past no longer feels relevant. That possibility makes the decision to reach out feel even more important. If they never try to speak honestly now, they may spend years wondering what your answer might have been. They are beginning to realize that uncertainty can linger much longer than rejection. Rejection may be painful, but it provides clarity. Uncertainty keeps questions alive indefinitely. After the realization that sparked this moment, they no longer want to live with those unanswered questions. They would rather know the truth about where things stand today than continue imagining possibilities that may not exist. This is why the feeling of urgency continues to grow stronger rather than fading away. It is not based on impulse. It is based on the recognition that meaningful connections deserve clarity, even if that clarity arrives later than expected. Right now, your soulmate is standing at a point where they can either continue pretending that everything is resolved or finally seek the understanding they never allowed themselves to pursue before. The reason they are trying to reach you now is because they have realized that some conversations become more important the longer they remain unspoken. As these realizations continued unfolding inside them, your soulmate began to notice how much their perspective on the past had quietly changed over the past few hours or days. Before this moment of urgency appeared, they had developed a way of thinking about the connection between you that allowed them to keep moving forward without confronting deeper emotions. In their mind, the story had always been simple. Two people met, shared meaningful experiences for a time, and then life naturally moved in different directions. That explanation felt logical and mature, and it helped them maintain a sense of stability. Yet the more they reflected now, the more they realized that the explanation had never been complete. It was not entirely false, but it was missing the emotional complexity that existed beneath the surface. Real connections rarely end as neatly as people pretend they do. More often, they fade slowly because both people are uncertain about what to say next. Looking back, your soulmate can see how hesitation played a role in many moments that shaped the distance between you. There were times when they sensed something shifting in the dynamic between you but did not know how to address it without risking misunderstanding. Instead of speaking openly, they chose to wait, hoping that clarity would eventually appear on its own. Waiting felt safe because it avoided the possibility of saying something that might make the situation more complicated. Yet waiting also meant that important conversations never happened. Over time, those missed conversations created the silence that eventually replaced the connection you once shared. At the time, that silence seemed like the natural conclusion to the relationship. Now, however, it feels more like a pause that was never fully examined. As they sit with this awareness, your soulmate finds themselves remembering moments that once seemed insignificant but now carry emotional meaning. They recall times when they almost reached out to you after the distance began to grow. Perhaps they saw something that reminded them of you, a song you both liked, a topic you once discussed passionately, or even a simple moment when they wished they could hear your perspective on something happening in their life. In those moments, the thought of contacting you appeared naturally. Yet each time, hesitation followed quickly behind it. Questions filled their mind. What if reaching out now feels awkward? What if you have already moved on completely? What if reopening communication only brings confusion instead of understanding? Those questions often ended the thought before it could turn into action. Over time, the habit of stopping themselves became automatic. They convinced themselves that leaving the past alone was the most respectful and sensible choice. But the recent realization that triggered this urgency has forced them to reconsider that belief. They are beginning to see how much their decisions were influenced by fear of uncertainty rather than clear understanding of your feelings. Fear can be subtle in this way. It disguises itself as patience, maturity, or respect for boundaries. Yet sometimes it simply prevents people from expressing what they truly feel. Your soulmate is recognizing that possibility now, and it is one of the reasons the urge to reach you feels so strong. They no longer want to rely on assumptions about what you might think or feel. They want to know the truth directly from you. Another reason this moment feels urgent is because they have begun to recognize how much the connection between you influenced their emotional growth. At the time, they may not have fully understood how meaningful your conversations and shared experiences were. But looking back now, they see how those interactions shaped their perspective on relationships, communication, and trust. With you, they often felt comfortable discussing topics that were difficult to talk about with others. There was a level of honesty that allowed both of you to share thoughts and fears without feeling judged. That kind of connection is not something people encounter every day. Because of that, the memories of those moments have remained vivid even after the silence between you began. When they meet new people or form new friendships, they sometimes notice how rare it is to find that same level of understanding again. This realization does not mean they have been unable to build new connections in their life. Life has continued, and they have met many people along the way. Yet the depth you once shared has remained a quiet reference point in their mind. It shaped the way they recognize meaningful interaction and authentic conversation. Understanding this now makes them appreciate the connection with you even more than they did before. It also explains why the thought of leaving everything unresolved suddenly feels uncomfortable. If the connection was truly meaningful, then it deserves at least one honest conversation about what happened and what each of you feels now. The urgency they feel comes from this realization. They are not trying to force the past to return exactly as it was. They know that time changes people and circumstances in ways that cannot be reversed. What they want instead is clarity. They want to understand whether the silence between you represents a true ending or simply a chapter that paused without explanation. They want to know whether the feelings that once existed between you were shared in the same way they experienced them. And most importantly, they want to replace uncertainty with truth, even if that truth leads to closure rather than reconnection. For a long time, they believed avoiding the conversation protected both of you from unnecessary complications. Now they see that avoiding it also prevented understanding. That realization is what makes this moment feel urgent. It is not about rushing or creating pressure. It is about recognizing that some questions remain important no matter how much time passes. Right now, your soulmate feels ready to face those questions honestly, and that is why the desire to reach you has become so strong. As the awareness inside them continues to deepen, your soulmate is beginning to understand that the urgency they feel is not simply about the past, but about the present moment and the opportunity that still exists right now. For a long time they believed that time alone had decided the outcome of the connection between you. They assumed that because months or perhaps even longer had passed without meaningful communication, the chapter had naturally closed for both of you. That belief gave them a sense of emotional order. It allowed them to place the memories in a quiet corner of their mind and focus on the forward motion of life. Yet the realization that recently surfaced has disrupted that entire perspective. They are beginning to see that time does not always create closure, sometimes it only creates distance. Distance can make things appear finished when they are actually unresolved. And when unresolved emotions remain beneath the surface long enough, they eventually demand attention again. That is exactly what is happening to them now. The urgency they feel is the result of recognizing how much of the story between you was shaped by silence rather than clear understanding. Looking back, they can now identify many moments where the connection between you might have evolved differently if even one honest conversation had taken place. Perhaps there was a time when one of you was uncertain about where things were going but did not know how to ask the question without sounding vulnerable. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding that slowly created distance because neither of you felt confident enough to address it directly. Situations like these happen in many relationships, and at the time they often feel small or temporary. But when they are left unspoken, they slowly build into something larger. Your soulmate is now recognizing how easily hesitation can turn into silence, and how silence can eventually look like closure even when neither person truly intended it to be that way. This realization has made them reconsider many of their past assumptions. They used to believe that if the connection was meant to continue, it would naturally find its way back without effort. But now they are beginning to see that meaningful connections sometimes require courage rather than patience. Waiting can be helpful in certain situations, but waiting too long can also allow uncertainty to harden into distance. When they think about this now, they remember specific moments when they almost reached out to you. There were times when they saw something that reminded them of a conversation you once shared, or when they wished they could hear your perspective on a decision they were facing. In those moments, the impulse to contact you appeared naturally. Yet almost every time, it was followed by hesitation. Questions would enter their mind immediately. What if reaching out now feels strange after so much time? What if they misread the situation and you no longer want to reopen that connection? What if trying to talk again only creates awkwardness instead of understanding? These questions often convince them to remain silent. Silence felt safer than risking the possibility of rejection or confusion. Over time, that silence became part of their routine. They learned to live with the idea that the connection belonged entirely in the past. But the recent moment of clarity changed how they see that silence. They now understand that avoiding uncertainty did not actually resolve anything. It simply delayed the opportunity for honest communication. This is why the present moment feels so significant to them. For the first time in a long while, they feel ready to face whatever truth exists between you rather than continuing to live with unanswered questions. That readiness has created the strong desire to reach you now rather than waiting any longer. Another reason the situation feels urgent is because they have become aware of how rare certain kinds of connections truly are. Since the last time you spoke meaningfully, they have continued living their life and meeting many different people. Some of those interactions were pleasant, and some developed into friendships or relationships. Yet through all those experiences, they quietly noticed something about the connection they once had with you. It had a depth that did not appear easily elsewhere. With you, conversations often felt genuine and natural rather than forced. There was an ease in the way thoughts and feelings were shared, even when the topics were serious or personal. That kind of emotional comfort is something many people search for but rarely find. Realizing this has made them appreciate what you shared together even more than they did before. It also made them question whether the silence between you truly reflected the value of that connection. The more they think about it, the more they feel that something meaningful deserves at least one honest conversation rather than being left as a collection of assumptions. The urgency they feel now comes from understanding that opportunities for clarity do not remain open forever. Life continues to move forward, and people's circumstances change in ways that cannot always be predicted. Waiting indefinitely for the perfect time to speak can mean missing the chance entirely. They are beginning to realize that if they do not reach out now, they may spend a long time wondering what might have happened if they had simply been honest about their thoughts and feelings. That possibility feels heavier than the risk of having the conversation itself. This is why the urge to contact you feels so strong right now. It is not about rushing or forcing anything. It is about acknowledging that meaningful connections deserve clarity and understanding, even if that clarity arrives later than expected. Your soulmate is recognizing that the silence between you does not necessarily define the entire story. There may still be space for an honest exchange that reveals what each of you truly felt and what you feel now. And that possibility is what makes this moment feel so important to them. As this realization continues to settle in, your soulmate is starting to see the entire situation between you from a perspective that feels far more honest than anything they allowed themselves to consider before. For a long time, they believed that the silence between you had already written the final chapter of the story. They assumed that if something meaningful was still meant to exist, it would have returned naturally by now without effort or explanation. That belief allowed them to move through life with a sense of emotional closure, even though that closure had never truly been confirmed. But now, after everything that has stirred inside them recently, they are recognizing that what they once called closure may have simply been avoidance. Avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of vulnerability, and perhaps even avoidance of admitting how important the connection had been. When people avoid something for long enough, it becomes easier to convince themselves that the issue no longer matters. Yet the moment that recently disrupted their thoughts proved that the connection still carries meaning. Otherwise it would not have returned so clearly to their mind. As they sit with this awareness, they begin to understand that the urgency they feel now is not about recreating the past exactly as it was. They know that time has passed and both of you have changed in ways neither of you could have predicted before. Life rarely allows two people to return to the same emotional place they once shared. Experiences, challenges, and new perspectives reshape who we become over time. Your soulmate understands that reality. What they feel now is not a demand to go backward but a need to understand what truly existed between you and what it means today. That difference is important to them because it changes the entire intention behind reaching out. They are not trying to force something to happen. They are trying to replace uncertainty with truth. The longer they reflect on this, the more they recognize how many assumptions shaped their understanding of the past. They assumed you had moved on emotionally because the silence continued. They assumed that reaching out again might make things uncomfortable or unwanted. They assumed that if you truly wanted to reconnect, you would have taken the first step. Each of these assumptions felt logical at the time, but now they are starting to see how fragile they actually were. Assumptions are rarely reliable because they are built on incomplete information. Without honest communication, both people create their own interpretations of what the other person might feel. Those interpretations can be completely different from reality. This realization has made your soulmate question how much of the distance between you was created by circumstances and how much was created by misunderstanding. It is possible that both of you were protecting yourselves in similar ways, believing that silence was the safest path forward. But silence often hides emotions rather than resolving them. That is why the thought of reaching out now feels so important. They do not want to spend years wondering whether the connection you shared ended because it truly needed to end or because neither of you felt comfortable starting the conversation that might have changed everything. This question has been quietly sitting in their mind for a long time, but they never allowed it to become strong enough to influence their actions. Now it has become impossible to ignore. Another realization that strengthens this urgency is the awareness that meaningful connections are rare. Over time they have interacted with many people and experienced different kinds of relationships and friendships. Some of those experiences were enjoyable and valuable in their own ways. Yet when they think honestly about emotional depth and genuine understanding, they keep returning to the memory of how natural communication felt between the two of you. With you, conversations did not require effort to remain interesting. Thoughts flowed easily, and even difficult topics could be discussed without fear of judgment. That level of openness is something many people spend years searching for. Recognizing that you once shared it has made them appreciate the connection more than they did when it was happening. At the time, it simply felt natural. Now they understand how uncommon it truly was. This realization has led them to question whether leaving everything unresolved is really the right way to honor that connection. When something meaningful ends without clarity, it can remain unfinished in the mind for years. Questions continue to appear in quiet moments, especially during times when life becomes reflective. Your soulmate has begun to realize that avoiding those questions does not eliminate them. It only postpones the moment when they must finally be faced. And the moment they are facing now feels different from any moment before. They feel more prepared to accept whatever answer exists, even if that answer confirms that both of you have moved in completely separate directions. Strangely, that possibility does not scare them as much as it once did. What scares them more is the idea of never knowing. Never understanding what you truly felt about the connection. Never discovering whether the silence between you represented a mutual decision or simply two people hesitating at the same time. Living with that kind of uncertainty can quietly follow someone for years. Your soulmate is starting to feel that they would rather risk the discomfort of an honest conversation than continue carrying unanswered questions into the future. That is the true source of the urgency behind reaching out. It is not driven by impulse or nostalgia. It comes from the realization that honesty, even when it arrives later than expected, is still better than living with permanent uncertainty. As these thoughts settle more deeply into their mind, your soulmate is beginning to understand that the moment they are experiencing right now may be one of those rare turning points that quietly reshape how someone approaches an important connection in their life. For a long time they lived with the belief that the silence between you had already decided everything. It felt easier to accept that explanation because it allowed them to focus on the forward movement of life without constantly questioning the past. But the realization that recently surfaced has changed how they interpret that silence. Instead of seeing it as a clear ending, they are starting to see it as something far more complicated. A pause filled with uncertainty, hesitation, and unspoken thoughts that neither of you may have fully understood at the time. This understanding has made them reflect on the emotional choices they made when the distance between you first began to grow. Back then, they often believed that waiting was the most respectful and careful approach. They thought that if something was meant to continue, it would eventually return on its own without needing to force a conversation. Waiting seemed like patience, and patience seemed like maturity. Yet with the perspective they have now, they can see that waiting also meant leaving important questions unanswered. Over time, the absence of those answers created assumptions that slowly replaced genuine understanding. They assumed you might prefer the distance because you did not reach out. They assumed that contacting you after time had passed might feel intrusive or unwelcome. They assumed that moving forward without reopening the past would protect both of you from unnecessary emotional confusion. But now they are recognizing how fragile those assumptions really were. Without direct communication, neither of you ever truly knew what the other person was feeling or thinking. Both of you may have been interpreting the silence in completely different ways. This realization is what makes the present moment feel so significant to them. They are beginning to see that the story they told themselves about the connection ending naturally may never have been confirmed by reality. It was simply the easiest explanation available at the time. The more they think about it, the more they realize that meaningful connections rarely disappear quietly without leaving questions behind. The fact that you still come to mind during reflective moments suggests that the emotional impact of the connection was stronger than they once admitted. When they think about you now, they do not only remember the moments themselves. They remember the feeling of being understood in a way that did not require constant explanation. With you, conversations often reached deeper topics naturally, without feeling forced or uncomfortable. That kind of communication created a sense of trust that is difficult to replicate once it is lost. Recognizing this has made them reconsider the way they approached the silence between you. Instead of seeing it as a clear answer, they now see it as something that may have been influenced by timing, hesitation, and mutual uncertainty. This awareness is what creates the urgency they feel about reaching you now. It is not an attempt to rush the situation or recreate something exactly as it was before. They understand that both of you have lived through new experiences since the last meaningful conversation you shared. Those experiences have shaped who you are today. The person you are now may be different from the person they once knew, just as they themselves have changed in ways they could not have predicted. But change does not erase the value of past connections. Sometimes it simply provides a new perspective on what those connections meant. Your soulmate is beginning to realize that leaving the story unfinished without at least one honest conversation may not be the best way to respect what you shared. Even if the conversation leads to closure rather than reconnection, it would still replace uncertainty with understanding. And understanding is something they have been missing for a long time. The longer they reflect on this, the more they see how living with unanswered questions can quietly influence a person's emotional life. Those questions appear in unexpected moments, during quiet evenings, while thinking about relationships, or when reflecting on how certain experiences shaped them. Over time, they realized that avoiding those questions never truly resolved them. It only postponed the moment when they would have to face them honestly. That moment seems to have arrived now. Your soulmate feels ready to approach the situation with openness rather than hesitation. They are prepared to listen to whatever you might want to share about how you experienced the connection between you. They are also ready to express their own thoughts more honestly than they did before. This willingness to be open is something that did not exist in the same way when the distance first began. Back then, uncertainty and fear of vulnerability influenced many of their decisions. Now they understand that vulnerability is not something to avoid completely. Sometimes it is necessary in order to reach genuine understanding. That is why the desire to reach you right now feels so strong. It is not driven by nostalgia alone or by the wish to return to the past exactly as it was. It is driven by the realization that meaningful connections deserve honesty and clarity, even if that clarity arrives later than expected. Your soulmate is recognizing that the silence between you does not have to remain the final word. There is still an opportunity to speak openly, to replace assumptions with truth, and to understand what the connection truly meant from both perspectives. That possibility is what makes this moment feel urgent and important to them.